This is Thought in Motion, a series dedicated to the seminars of psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. Today's video covers Lecture 1 of Seminar 3. The theme of Seminar 3 concerns the place of psychosis in Freud, and for Lacan that ultimately means situating psychosis within the registers of the imaginary, symbolic, and real. The central Freudian text to be addressed in this seminar will be the case of Schreber, which can be found in the Standard Edition, Volume 12. The following questions will be addressed today. How does Lacan's understanding of psychosis differ from contemporary conceptions? And 2, how is psychosis related to the three registers of imaginary, symbolic, and real? In this first lecture, we're provided some insight into what Lacan means by psychosis. Right away, it becomes clear that we're talking about something both broader and more specific than how it's approached in psychology today. In the current edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, DSM-5, schizophrenia figures centrally among the psychoses. It contains the broadest set of symptoms in which at least 2 must be present for a period of time to qualify for a diagnosis. These symptoms include delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, grossly disorganized or catatonic behavior, and negative symptoms such as flat affect or the loss of will or motivation. Then there are conditions like the delusional disorder, in which the delusions must be of a, quote, non-bizarre nature. These then are distinguished from what are typically classified as personality disorders, which under previous editions of the DSM were placed under the umbrella term of cluster A, including paranoid, schizoid, and schizotypal personality disorders. Psychosis for Lacan may include all of these or even none of them. This is because Lacan views psychosis as a clinical structure rather than a set of symptoms or psychotic phenomena such as delusions and hallucinations. Indeed, a subject can have a latent psychotic structure that never gives rise to express psychotic phenomena. Also notable is that Lacan admits to the organic dimension of psychosis as a necessary but not sufficient basis for it. It's not sufficient because psychosis also entails a particular relationship to the symbolic. As a quick aside, in speaking of the organic, Lacan equates the biological constitution of the mind with psychology and provides us a definition of psychology as the whole of the biological individual's behavior in relation to the natural environment. Of course, this is what Lacan finds problematic with psychology as well, as it gives rise to what he calls various myths that he has spent much of the last 2 seminars attempting to dispel. This next question we'll be returning to throughout the seminar. In fact, it's probably the question of the seminar. As we proceed through the lectures, we'll spiral into deeper explorations of it. But let's take up a preliminary consideration of it now. Lacan reminds us that the symbolic is what is beyond all understanding, but what understanding is inserted into. It holds a disruptive influence over human relations, but also structures those relations. In contrast, the imaginary governs the world of the animal, and it supports its behavior as it moves toward its natural aims. However, for the human, the image is ordinarily taken up, remolded, and reanimated by the symbolic order. And this is what Lacan means when he says understanding, situated on the imaginary plane, is inserted into the symbolic. And so, in other words, there is no imaginary without the symbolic in ordinary development. But this is precisely where, in psychosis, there is a breakdown in the ordinary unfolding of things. To help us understand this, Lacan takes the example of a psychotic's encounter with a red car in the street as it begins to take on a surprising degree of importance for the subject, conferring upon the red car meaning and indeed perhaps even a kind of pernicious intention. When structured and organized by the symbolic, the color red would ordinarily be situated alongside its opposing symbols, such as another color, black, for example. Yet red may instead be understood from within the imaginary order as making one see red. That is, it contains the characteristic of hostility or anger. One would only come to that conclusion if only they were thoroughly identified with the imaginary to such a degree that they would not be able to distinguish imaginary from the real. In such a situation, the symbolic is not merely repressed, but is fundamentally rejected. This leads to a critical distinction between Verneinung and Verwerfung. Lacan reminds the audience of Hippolyte's commentary on Freud's Verneinung, which can be found in Seminar 1. From that commentary, we're introduced to the idea of Bejahung, a primordial affirmation of the symbolic that precedes and is necessary for repression to occur. In other words, for the symbolic to be repressed, it must have been, in some sense, already accepted and integrated into and as the subject. So, Verneinung, or negation, is not a denial of the symbolic to core, but instead is a denial of it and its mediating influence in the life of the subject, an influence that it has regardless of this denial. So, it's repressed, but repression here also means the return of the repressed, as the symbolic has already taken hold of the subject and molded it. As such, repression merely necessitates another pathway by which the unconscious discourse can realize itself, and that's often in the form of symptoms. In contrast, Verwerfung means there is no primordial affirmation before repression, that the symbolic order was refused before it could even take hold. This doesn't entirely rid the subject of language, and that's really important because psychosis has, according to Lacan, been understood purely at the level of the imaginary and other forms of psychology. And for Lacan, you cannot understand psychosis without an appreciation of the symbolic and the subject's position vis-a-vis it. And yet, rather than the symbolic returning in the form of another signifier, as we see in neurosis, for example, the rejected symbolic instead re-emerges out there in the real as, for example, a hallucination. And though it's not stated in this lecture, and though he talks about the symbolic reappearing only in the real, I've already alluded to the idea that I believe this is an expression of the real that is fused with the imaginary, that there is no adequate separation between the imaginary and real that's often evoked through the intervention of the symbolic. And as such, when the symbolic appears in the real, it's filtered through the subject's imaginary relation to the real, an imaginary relation that the subject is thoroughly identified with. Another way Lacan discusses psychosis is in light of schema L. As we've addressed in the videos for Seminar 2, the discourse between big other and subject is interrupted by the imaginary relation of ego and little other, whereby this discourse, or full speech, goes through a detour to realize itself. This then entails a particular relation between the subject and its ego, which in ordinary circumstances is a precarious relationship, constantly under threat of being revoked. However, in psychosis, the subject is wholly identified with the ego. There is no doubt for this subject that it is the ego. And this lack of doubt is important for psychosis, as later on Lacan will discuss the relation with the ego as characterized by certainty, whereas neurosis is characterized by doubt. And so in psychosis, when the subject speaks to the ego, it delivers itself to the ego in the real, as a kind of verbal hallucination that is auditorily sensed. The subject becomes then a literal third party who observes and comments upon the ego's activities, often in a manner that can be very disturbing and unsettling. So I look forward to beginning yet another seminar with you, Seminar 3, in which we will dive a little bit more deeply into clinical phenomena and clinical structures than we have in the previous two seminars. I know that is an interest of many of you and wanting to see more of that, so here will be an opportunity to develop that part of Lacan's thinking a little bit more fully. I'd like to thank the following for supporting this channel on Patreon. If you wish to support this work on Patreon, the link is below in the description. You can also support this work by liking and sharing this video, as well as subscribing to my channel. As always, thank you for watching, and until next time, be well.